Welcome to today's session. It's going to be a nutrition session on energy balance, addressing the section of your workbooks which is P4M2. I'm going to sort of go through a few bits and pieces on the slides, which are also I'm going to talk about the workbook as well as we go, so hopefully it will make a bit of sense if you've got your workbook in front. If you haven't and you're choosing to use the planner that I'm going to give, I'll try and sort of follow a similar sort of structure with the planner. So, so the concept of energy balance is sort of addressed in that previous session. On the left-hand side here, you can see this sort of scale, sort of explaining that energy intake is all the food and drink, sort of calorific, that we bring into our body, and all that goes out is can kind of come under three things. So our basal metabolic rate, so this is the sort of calories that we use kind of at rest. The thermic effect of food, so the energy cost of actually sort of digesting our food and the sort of extra kind of heat that generates, and also the effect of physical activity, so the energy cost of that. The picture on the right hand side shows the sort of calorific value of the sort of nutrients we take into our body, or alcohol, which is sort of not a nutrient but still quite calorific. So carbohydrate 4 calories per gram, proteins 4 calories per gram, fats 9 calories per gram, and alcohol 7 calories a gram, hence why it's so sort of calorific. So the first thing that you're presented with on your workbook is asking you to explain the types of metabolism. It's a funny one, actually. I think it's sort of relating to this concept of catabolism and anabolism. So metabolism is sort of catabolic versus that which is anabolic. So anabolic metabolism is sort of related to this concept of building things up. So what it's considering is that the sort of concept of so anabolism is when you build things up. So I've got a picture of the big sort of muscly chap on the bottom because he's been taking anabolic steroids. So steroids themselves are not always don't always promote growth. It's a type of sort of drug delivery. The fact that they are anabolic will cause things like muscle cells and other cells in the body actually to increase their sort of protein synthesis. So whenever something is anabolic, it's making something more complex from simple things. So anabolism in muscle builds up muscles. When blood sugar is taken up by insulin into muscles, we create glycogen. So muscle growth and repair is an anabolic process. Building glycogen stores in muscle and liver is an anabolic process. And also building fat in adipose tissue. So you're drawing in triglycerides, which sort of cause the fat cells to swell. So you're taking in that small fatty acid and you're adding it to that big lipid cell, and it's becoming much more sort of big and complex. So when the body's in an anabolic state, it's kind of growing. So this is important with this concept of energy balance, in that if I have a positive energy balance, i.e. more calories than I am using, it allows me to sort of slip into that anabolic phase or anabolic state. So you might sort of hear bodybuilders go through sort of phases where they're sort of bulking, and that's them creating a sort of an energy surplus to allow their bodies to be kind of anabolic. On the flip side, you've got this catabolic. So this is breaking down molecules or breaking down complex molecules into smaller ones. So for example, muscle breaking down can actually cause the release of glucose into the body. So when we're really exhausted, so in sort of long distance runs, when you sort of reach those exhaustive states, the body might start drawing on muscle protein to actually provide glucose into the body. When you're starved as well, so it does a similar thing. Your body uses its complex store, so it uses adipose tissue, so fat. It might even start breaking down some glycogen from the muscle, but might also start breaking down protein from the muscle. So things like liver releasing glycogen into the bloodstream. Remember, glycogen is the body's storage form of glucose, and also adipose tissue releasing fatty acids for energy, so as fat stores break down. So if you're looking at fat loss, one of the important things you want to be is in this kind of catabolic state, this idea that your body is sort of using its own resources, trying to burn that fat, and to sort of provide the energy for the body. This is a very complex picture. It might be useful to take time to just pause my presentation and see what's going on. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of bits, but I've put some notes alongside this lecture. This is a fasted state metabolism. So this is someone who hasn't eaten for a long period of time. What you can see up here, you can see this is a fat cell, and it's mobilizing, it's releasing fatty acids. Here we are, that are then converted by the liver. So here, fatty acids, and they're converted by the liver to be used to supply energy for the brain. So in this fasted catabolic state, the body starts using its fat stores. The other thing that's important here is this is a muscle on this right hand side, but what it's doing, it's giving up its protein here to the liver, and it's using it to create glucose. So it's sort of mobilizing that muscle tissue in a way to provide blood glucose. This is pretty, it doesn't usually happen sort of immediately, but it will happen. So the other thing that you have in muscles is glycogen here. So glycogen is being used for energy production. So the glycogen within the muscle is going to be used for energy production. So when we're in this fasted state, when we're looking, we're sort of almost kind of looking for food. Our body is burning its fat stores. It's using its own glycogen stores. And it's mobilizing those both for energy. In the opposite state, when we're sort of fed, our fat stores fill up, our muscles take on board glycogen, and that use of protein as an energy store stops. So this picture, you may want to, I say you'll have this in your notes. This is just the energy cost of different activities, which will, to one sense, sort of determine how well balanced we are with our energy intake and our output. So we looked a little bit in the last lecture about how you can sort of estimate calorific use during exercise. Here's some examples. So let's go with the men. So if you were playing basketball intensively for an hour, you might burn about 632 calories per hour. You know, that's lots of sort of high intensity sprinting, lots of sort of intermittent work, more so than if you were doing sort of steady state jogging for a long period of time. So it seems like that high intensity, high paced exercise is a real sort of calorie burner. What's interesting, even just something like brisk walking, so for people who aren't able to do very high intensity exercise, still burns a fair amount, roughly double than sitting busily at your office there for 200. So that's the sort of something for you to look over in your own time. So the concept that's next asked for in question 15 is this concept of positive and negative energy balance. What I think is important is that you have a concept that energy balance can be in the long term and the short term. So in the long term, a positive energy balance means you are ending each day or ending each week or ending each month, ending each year, having taken in more calories than you've expended. Now in the long term, that's going to mean that, so in the long term, if you've got that sort of more positive energy balance, it may lead to weight gain. in the long term. If you have a negative energy balance, it may lead to weight loss. So when we sort of talk about energy balance, we need to really sort of determine whether we're talking about short or long term. So the short term, I'll sort of cover very quickly. So this is sort of the kind of energy balance whilst you're exercising. So this is the sort of idea that whilst you're exercising, your energy stores might become depleted, which means you'll experience fatigue. So here we've got, I've got glycogen stores are a major determinant of fatigue, and we'll look at this a bit later. But a lack of short-term energy stores, i.e. glycogen and glucose, in the short term will contribute to fatigue. So the concept of a negative energy balance in the short term means you're not meeting the sort of caloric needs of exercise. A positive short-term energy balance means that you are. In the long term, a positive energy balance means that you are meeting your needs, but a really excessive positive energy balance might mean you lead to weight gain. If you have a long-term negative energy balance, you could actually lead to some health problems. So you could lose too much fat. You might not provide your body with enough nutrients to repair and grow, so it could actually act as a sort of to lower performance and lower health. So this picture just I've only got this up just because I think it's quite a nice way to think about the consequences of a long-term energy balance. Certainly if you're looking at sort of exploring the sort of slightly higher merit criteria, it doesn't need a huge explanation, but just in terms of sort of how you're thinking about how energy balance influences performance. So from a long-term perspective, excess weight, excess mass will affect performance. So on the left-hand side we have a large, greatest car ever made, the Lexus. And on the right-hand side we have a small, nippy Lotus. So what you see is the Lexus has a sort of very powerful engine, more powerful than the little Lotus on the right-hand side. But it's sort of slower to accelerate, harder to stop, and also harder to go around corners in. So the extra mass almost sort of negates that extra power that the engine gives. So in order to accelerate, really the sort of acceleration is a product of power and mass, really. So if I want to accelerate something more quickly, I can reduce the mass or I can give it more power. So if you've got an athlete who has gained weight, whether that's through muscle or fat, you're going to need more power to accelerate them to the same pace. In the same way, stopping, a large body, a large mass traveling at a high velocity is difficult to stop. It requires more effort, it requires bigger brakes. So if you've got an athlete who's particularly large, again, whether it's through fat or muscle, it means that they're going to be harder to stop. So if you think about the sort of the Lotus and the Lexus, the Lotus is much easier and quicker to stop. It's much sort of easier and more agile. Its agility is going to be better. So there's benefits to being light. It's also more efficient. So through sort of stop-start movements, heavy athletes need more power and more energy to use them. This is why long-distance runners, you don't see them sort of lumbering around. They're sort of very lithe, thin, efficient bodies. So here we've got this sort of concept of momentum. I've got Jonah Lomu, who's a sort of famous New Zealand rugby player who sadly died a couple of years ago. But when he burst on the scene, he was, an incredible phenomenon. He's 6'5", over 19 stone, but could run 100 meters in around 11 seconds, maybe less. And what's interesting, he wasn't particularly agile, but he had this momentum. He just went through people. So having mass, whether it's through sort of excess fat or muscle, is beneficial in some sports, just because you can go through people. On the right hand side, I've got Christian Wade, who is I thought was an absolutely phenomenal rugby player. But you can see he's much smaller. He's about 5'9", 5'10". Not a small man, but he's incredibly agile. So he sort of, when he runs, it is like he sort of corners like a fly. But he never really sort of made it as an England player. A lot of people felt he wasn't quite big enough, and he wasn't this sort of power player that would crash through people. And he's subsequently he's currently trying to get a career in the NFL. And he seems to be doing all right in the grand scheme of things. He's having to learn a new game, but just his ability, his agility is fantastic, because he is that little bit lighter. So he's able to sort of move and be more agile. So it's useful to think about it from a sort of footballing perspective, about how lightness because you've got less momentum, you're easier, you can be more agile. So it's quite interesting. A couple of years ago, they sort of ranked the Premier League squads in terms of height, and Manchester City was the shortest by quite a long way. And they sort of are in the model of sort of Pep Guardiola's Barcelona, that lots of sort of small, nippy players who are very agile, who are able to change direction quickly. So excess fat, excess mass, excess weight of any kind will mean that you have more momentum when you're moving, which means you're less agile, which means you're harder to accelerate, you're harder to decelerate. So it will affect performance in a lot of ways. I've got this picture here just to sort of consider this concept of optimum body weight and body fat percentage. I've got two sort of porky boxers. So I've got Andy Ruiz. I'm not a boxing fan. I've got Tyson Fury on the left hand side, and also I've got Anthony Joshua, who is a sort of single digit body fat percentage boxer, who, when he met Andy Ruiz, everyone thought he was going to absolutely whop him, because he's in this sort of physical specimen. But then the actual sort of, in that instance, the sort of supposedly out of shape boxer actually beat him. So some sports, there's a little benefit to having a bit of extra fat on you. Certainly boxing, it doesn't hurt. And I know sort of, you look at Muhammad Ali, and he's sort of dancing around the ring, being very agile, and actually, when you look at the movement patterns in boxing, there's not much sort of movement of the feet in that fashion, which is going to be sort of slowed down by that extra body fat. It may be beneficial. It might give you a bit of padding. It might mean that they're able to train harder, because they're always in this sort of positive energy balance. So some sports, there's a sort of optimum body fat, and it may not be worth chasing that extra 1% of body fat percentages. It doesn't have a huge influence on performance. So what I'd like you to do, I want you to pause your presentation. I just want you to take time to complete the introduction. I just want to think about how you're writing your explanations in your work. So I've got here, so you're talking about the concept of energy balance, how it might affect performance. So the first one is, an athlete's mass and body composition can dramatically affect performance. Acceleration is a product of mass and power. So an athlete who has a large mass will require more. So you might discuss how to accelerate at the same pace, you need more power. Having a large amount of excess body fat may be detrimental to football performance for two ways. And then I've listed two ways here which I want you to expand upon. So one, I want you to consider that concept of agility, and also that concept of energy cost. So, whether it's muscle or fat, if I suddenly put on 2 extra stone, I've got to carry that around for the whole match, haven't I? Muscle is metabolically active, so that's going to require more energy. So actually being sort of larger costs energy. It's harder to move you, it's harder to stop you, it's harder to accelerate you. So there's some sports and some situations where the energy cost is really important. And then there's a last little note on body fat percentage, which I want you to consider. So just pause the presentation and have a little look at that. Okay, it is possible to have too little body fat, and I've got an example here of what's called the female athletic triad. So I'm going to just talk you through this. We don't need to go hugely into the physiology, but there are a lot of sports where, particularly women, the female athletic triad is really only about women, but there's sports, things like gymnastics, where there's a real sort of incentive to keep a very low body fat percentage. So again, it means you accelerate quickly. It means you're lighter in landing. You're more agile when you move. So athletes are often almost sort of treading a very fine balance between sort of positive and negative energy balance. They often have very calorie restricted diets, and are often the type of people that might have quite sort of disordered eating patterns. So what they end up with is this very low energy availability. So some of them will be anorexic, so they're not eating enough. They sort of have this, again, this kind of disordered eating patterns. This leads the body to reduce its production of estrogen. Now, you need estrogen to stimulate your menstrual cycle. So what happens is you get, or women get, reduced, they get sort of menstrual disturbance, so there are absence of periods. Now, in the absence of periods, in the absence of estrogen causes bone to hold on to its minerals. So if you don't have estrogen, the cells that break up bone don't get broken down, so they sort of they continue breaking down bone, and the cells that build up bone don't work as well. So you end up with a bone mineral density being decreased. So in a noticeable proportion of athletes, they are at risk of this female athletic triad. So number one, disordered eating, low availability of nutrients, menstrual disturbance, and low bone mineral density. So the bone mineral density leads to an increased risk of fractures and early osteoporosis. So there's a note in your workbook about the effect of climate on energy balance. There's a couple of points here. I'm going to start with cold on this side. There's a slight increase in energy use in cold. It seems to do something quite strange to the fat cells. So what happens, the blood vessels in your periphery and in your fat tends to constrict. So you get this sort of vasoconstriction of blood vessels. That seems to impair the ability of those fat cells to mobilize fatty acids into the bloodstream. This lack of fatty acids being mobilized means that you use your body's glycogen stores more. So that means glycogen is a less efficient form of fuel than fat. So fat is, we kind of looked before, 9 calories per gram, but when we burn fat aerobically, it's a very efficient, we get lots and lots of ATP. Glycogen, not quite so much. So it means that we sort of burn through our stores of fuel a little bit more quickly. And we'll see in a minute, glycogen is a sort of key determinant of fatigue. So exercise in the cold tends to limit our use of fatty acids and increases our use of glycogen. Heat on this side doesn't massively alter metabolism so much. I think it modifies behavior a little bit more. So I've put here, it isn't altered wildly by heat, but our ability to exercise intensively may be curtailed. So what you see, you sometimes see in football, actually, in certain sort of footballing cultures, playing slightly sort of different styles, much more sort of used to conserving energy. And I think there's a bit of that, is that actually it is difficult to exercise for long periods intensively in these hot environments. Your body doesn't massively change the sort of metabolism, the mobilizing of fats, the mobilizing of glycogen, but any muscle contraction will create heat. Excess heat limits to a certain extent our ability to burn glycogen, to use glycogen and use glucose in our muscles. So it means that our energy use is sort of just dropped off a little bit. But I think a bit of it, I think most of it is about our sort of changes in behaviour rather than sort of muscle physiology. So just moving on to 4 slides, well, I'll give you the notes which show the reference for these. These are all from a book called Physiology of Sport and Exercise by Kenny, Wilmore and Costal. It's a 2012 book. So if you're using these in your assignments, make sure you do reference them. This picture shows the short-term energy balance. So the short-term effect of energy balance is largely determined by glycogen. So endurance performance is very dependent on your feelings of fatigue and your glycogen levels. In the same way that intermittent exercise, you're going to be working at a much higher intensity in bursts, which means you're going to burn through glycogen. Now, what we see on the left-hand side, this is related to a person who is running at 70% of their maximum heart rate, or around 70% of their VO2 max. Constantly. Now what you see, if we sort of trace from this left picture, this exercise time increases along there. So it's a long run, goes up to 3 hours, but this will be an elite runner, just having a jog. Now what you see is this line down here is their glycogen stores. So they measured glycogen stores in the gastrocnemius, in the calf muscle. So what you can see is as glycogen stores, as exercise continues, glycogen stores consistently decrease. Now, on the right-hand side, you've got this concept of perceived exertion, how hard they're finding exercise. Now, what you see is they didn't find it hard at all for about an hour and 3/4. But as glycogen stores dipped low, that perception of exertion started to reach into this exhaustive and heavy phase. So what we draw from this is that when glycogen levels are low, feelings of exertion, how hard exercise feels, go up. Even if you've still got a fair amount in the tank, it begins to feel low. Remember, this person's running at 70% of their maximum heart rate, so this is unlikely to be creating lactic acid. The feelings of fatigue are mostly concerned with lowered levels of glycogen in the muscle. Here we've got another exploration of glycogen in muscles. This is a person on the left hand side. What we see is they're starting, or we've got 2 people. One is on a high carbohydrate diet, one is on a low carbohydrate diet, so they're 40% of their diet's calories is coming from carbohydrate. The other person is 70% of their diet is coming from carbohydrate. They're taking part in here a bout of exercise. Now what you can see is in both people it depleted their glycogen stores. Now they have another bit of exercise planned 24 hours later, and then 24 hours after that, and then finally 4 hours after that. Now what you should see is at that second bout of exercise, my high carbohydrate diet person is up here, their glycogen stores are much higher. My low carbohydrate person, do it in a slightly different colour, is down here. And if you take that further, after the next, or just before the next bout of exercise, their glycogen stores are there, and their glycogen stores are there in that last bout. And again, if you follow the high carbohydrate person, they remain much higher. So you can see each time they recover more quickly. And if you think back to the previous slide, low glycogen stores were associated with feelings of fatigue. So these repeated bouts of high intensity exercise are going to instill more feelings of fatigue in that person with the low carbohydrate diet, who's got that negative energy balance. Here, again, another concept of short-term energy balance. We've got three sort of people who were on different diets, and they were asked to run to exhaustion at 75% of their maximum, 75% of their VO2 max. So here, this person was on a low carbohydrate diet here. Their initial glycogen stores were quite low, they're around 50, and their time to exhaustion was about 60 minutes. This person here, on a normal diet, their glycogen stores were 100 millimoles per kilogram, and they took 100 minutes to exertion. And you can see that last person on that high carbohydrate diet, much larger glycogen stores and a much longer time to exhaustion. So this is an interesting one when you're looking at sprinting and intermittent exercise on glycogen stores. I'll just talk you through one bit first. So this person is running at 31% of their VO2 max, so kind of a really slow jog. What you see is their glycogen levels in, again, I think they're gastronyemia, so they all start at a similar sort of amount, but it's got their exercise time and their sort of before and after glycogen stores. So this person, I'm just tracing along here, has a long time of exercising, so it was, nearly 3 hours at the end, and they've almost halved their glycogen stores. So they're sort of, they'll beginning to feel fatigue quite quickly. Now, this person is exercising at 150% of their VO2 max, which sounds odd, but if you think about your VO2 max, you're finding the maximal amount that you can take in and use, so the maximum amount of oxygen you can take in and use during exercise. Now, if I work anaerobically, I can work at a higher intensity than my 100% VO2 max. So if I sprint, I can work much higher. I max out my ability to take in and use oxygen, but I'm using my anaerobic systems to work that much harder. Now what you can see is on this person in blue who's working at that intensity, they burn through their glycogen stores within 20 minutes. I mean, they must be going at a hell of a rate of knots. So what we draw from this is higher intensity exercise will use glycogen stores more rapidly than low intensity. That's fairly straightforward, you can imagine that. Generally, most exercise below sort of 60 minutes or so, the glycogen stores don't have a massive impact upon fatigue. But where we have intermittent exercise like football, because you've got these repeated bursts of activity, we use glycogen at a higher rate, and energy balance becomes much more critical for those feelings of fatigue particularly. So this is why it's important to have things like carbohydrate feedings at half time and also during the match whenever possible. It's important to come into the exercise with fully stocked glycogen stores. So far we've seen that glycogen depletion is associated with increased feelings of fatigue. Having a high carbohydrate diet allows athletes glycogen stores to replenish more quickly after training. They start exercise with greater levels of glycogen. Having adequate stocks of carbohydrate allows athletes to exercise for longer time before reaching exhaustion when running at 75% VO2 max. And higher intensity exercise burns through glycogen stores more quickly. So this is just a quick slide I popped in just to show the importance of recovery. So on the left hand side we've got this red column. Now what it's trying to show you is we've got two groups of athletes. One group took carbohydrate immediately after exercise. One group took it 2 hours after exercise. And what we're looking at in the first block here is athletes' glycogen stores. So what you see on this left hand side, I'll just put a little star on it, is that these people, they had a high carbohydrate immediately, and these people in blue waited 2 hours. So after 2 hours, the group that had a carbohydrate meal had quite high carbohydrate stocks, and the people that hadn't eaten any carbohydrate yet had very low levels of carbohydrate. So the lesson is, get something in you immediately after you finish playing. So what you see here on the right hand side, you can see that actually what's then happened is if you revisited both groups and looked at the recovery between hours 2 and 4, you'd see that even though the red group had eaten something immediately after exercise and had nothing since, their carbohydrate levels are still higher than the group in blue who had eaten something within the last 2 hours. So it shows you that value of taking on board carbohydrate immediately as you've finished. It stocks up your glycogen stores preferentially. It's almost like a freebie meal. So this is just another a sort of summary of sort of energy usage during exercise. I'm going to leave that up there. I'm not going to go into it at all. It's just another resource. This one talks about body fat percentage actually for different types of athletes. So actually, I will dig into it a little bit. I do lie. So what you see here, basketball players generally somewhere between 6 and 12% body fat. So these are sort of pretty decent basketball players. Be interesting if is there boxing on there? No, I haven't. So you've got wrestlers, sort of 5 to 6% body fat. If you took something like swimming, again, really low body fat percentage, slightly higher for women. They sort of tend to have slightly more fat, more sort of essential fat within them. So most of their figures are just slightly higher. So I'll leave that up there if you wish to pause and take any of the information from it. So in summary, these are the key points I've covered, and hopefully there's been some important bits that you can take out and sort of feed into your assignments. So an athlete who is heavy needs more force to accelerate them. This is this concept of sort of a positive long-term energy balance. If people are heavy, they can be harder to accelerate. Momentum is the product of mass and velocity. So if you have a heavy athlete who is moving quickly, they have a lot of momentum. They're hard to stop. That's great in rugby, not so great in football, where you might want to stop suddenly and change direction. Climate can affect metabolism in the cold and exercise behaviour in the heat. So we looked a little bit about how in the cold it changes that sort of peripheral circulation. In a short term, energy balance will determine feelings of fatigue. So if you have a negative energy balance in the short term, you will experience greater feelings of fatigue. Low glycogen stores are sort of primarily responsible for those feelings of fatigue. And sort of understanding that concept of glycogen levels in our muscle leads us to sort of maybe sort of make sure that we keep our levels stocked up, that we have a sort of in-match strategy, we have a pre-match strategy, and then also post-match we get them stocked up nice and quickly. We've got this kind of carbohydrate window where if we take in carbohydrate, it's stored preferentially in our glycogen stores. So hopefully there's a few bits and pieces you can pick out. As ever, use your course book to inform you, particularly if you're working in with the sort of course pamphlets that you're given to hand to fill out. Otherwise, good luck.